Okay, so we're moving into our next unit dealing with the Texas legislature, excuse me. So today we are going to, or in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the structure of our legislature here in lesson 1. So a little bit of background information. Texas political culture. We talked about Texas political culture in the last unit, knowing that our political culture is very traditionalistic mixed with individualistic. And so it did affect the creation of the branches of government at the Texas level. There is significant distrust, or was significant distrust, and probably still is to a large extent, by Texas legislators or Texas framers of the Constitution in regards to government. They didn't trust government. They didn't feel like government always had their best interest at heart. And a lot of this is going to have to do with that carpetbagger's Constitution that Texas was governed under after the Civil War. And so when they create our legislature, they're going to build in some things that really limit the ability of the legislature to do certain things. And the first thing is that the Texas legislature is actually a part-time legislature. They do not meet but once every 2 years. So on odd-numbered years, we're going to see the legislature meet. And so anytime it's an odd-number year, at the very beginning of the year, from January to May, for 140 days, our legislature meets. And they do not meet on even-numbered years. And so this is really going to be a limiter of our legislature, and that distrust is going to be worked into our Constitution. So the structure and size of the Texas legislature. We do have a bicameral legislature, just like the national legislature. We have two houses, two chambers. We have the House of Representatives, which is created with 150 members statewide. They're elected for 2-year terms, and they represent about 167,637 constituents per representative. So that's the ratio of constituents, citizens, to representatives in the legislature. The House of Representatives is ran by the Speaker of the House, and then we have a Senate. We're going to get more into depth on each one of these houses in just a moment. The Senate is made up of 31 members. They are elected to 4-year terms. So half of the membership is re-elected every 2 years. And in the second year of each decade, all seats are up for re-election. So after the census and after reapportionment, all seats are going to be up for re-election. And then they represent 811,147 constituents per senator, so that's the ratio in the Senate. So a significant amount of people that they're representing when they're elected to office. And interestingly enough, our Senate is ran by the Lieutenant Governor. So at the federal level, the Vice President's job is to oversee the Senate, but his job is largely ceremonial, and he doesn't have a whole lot of power except to break ties. And so by and large, you don't see the Vice President actually participating in the legislative functions. But in Texas, the Lieutenant Governor actually has significant power and runs that Senate and has a significant role in what legislation is going to be passed and put forth. And so we're going to see as we move forward that the Lieutenant Governor has a lot of power, even though he is an executive branch member, has a lot of power in the legislative branch. So just like at the federal level, there are certain qualifications that you have to meet in order to become a legislator, to stand for election. There are formal qualifications. For the House, you must be at least 21 years old, not very old. So you can run at a very early age. There's a residency qualification. You must be a U.S. citizen. You must have lived in Texas for 2 years, and you must have lived in the district that you're running for 1 year. In the Senate, you got to be a little older. You got to be at least 26 years old. Also a residency qualification. Again, a U.S. citizen, lived in Texas for 5 years, and again, lived in the district you plan to represent or run in for 1 year. you also have to be a qualified voter. Now, you don't have to be a registered voter, you just have to be a qualified voter. You have to have the ability to be a voter in Texas in order to run for office. And so a qualified voter simply means that you are not a convicted felon, because in Texas, if you're a convicted felon, then you have your voting rights stripped from you. You also have to, as I said, it doesn't even mean you have to be registered to vote. It just means that if you so chose to register to vote, you had the qualifications to register. So you can't be under 18. Obviously, there are those age restrictions. Children and felons and things are not going to be qualified voters. So even though there are some formal qualifications that are outlined in the Constitution, there are some informal qualifications that are not. They're sort of these unwritten qualifications, these unwritten rules regarding your ability to run for office. There are some big barriers for participation into political life to be elected to the House or the Senate. Typically, you have to have a higher income. Typically, legislators are going to have a significant income because they work only part-time, and they also only receive part-time pay. And so they actually only receive about $7,000 a year in a salary, and so it's obviously a salary that you cannot live on. And so you have to have the ability to have money in order to sustain yourself, because you cannot be a professional legislator and live off the money that you are receiving as a legislator in Texas. And so typically we're going to see people who are wealthier, in line with that traditionalistic and individualistic political culture. You're going to see the wealthier, more elite members of society running for office. Typically higher levels of education. You're not going to typically see individuals who are uneducated at the college level and beyond. And so you're going to see individuals with a higher level of formal education. Typically, occupation is going to be significant in determining who is going to run for office. By and large, we see individuals in business and in law run for office. And if you think back to those political cultures that we talked about, by and large, it says these elite groups who are friendly to business are going to be the ones who govern, and so we see that in Texas. Typically, it's going to be lawyers, business people who have the ability to run for office. You also have to have a knowledge of state politics, so you're involved in that process. You understand state politics. You understand the issues facing the state. And then you have to have the ability to raise money for campaigns, and this is something that every politician has to have access to, because it's very expensive to run a campaign. And so because of these informal qualifications, we by and large see a very homogenous group of people who run for office. It's a very not diverse group, less diverse than the overall population of Texas. Typically, they're going to be white, male, old, well-educated professionals that run for office and that are elected. And so we're going to see, if we looked at the demographics of the state, they probably would not match up with the demographics of the individuals who represent Texas in the Texas legislature. They're by and large going to be white, old, male individuals. So I said that we have a part-time legislature, and we do, and the sessions for a legislation are what are called biennial sessions, which means they meet every 2 years, and they only meet for 140 days. And as I alluded to earlier, they meet on odd-numbered years, and they begin in January of odd-numbered years. Texas is only one of 4 states that employs a biennium. It is something that has been moved away from. It's not very common in the other states across the nation. So we're only one of 4 states that actually employs this. And at the end of the 140 days, there's a process called sine die. And what this means is that the legislature must adjourn. They cannot keep themselves in session. They don't have the ability to keep going if they're not finished with their work. In 140 days, at the end of that 140 days, the legislature must adjourn. They cannot extend their own session. They cannot create their own special session. They do not have the power to do that. They have exactly 140 days every 2 years to do the business of our government and our states. So at the end of those 140 days, they have to adjourn. The only person in the state who can call a special session is the governor. And so we're going to see that used on some level for political reasons, because the governor is going to be the individual who will control the agenda. When the governor calls a special session, they control the agenda, and the legislature can only work on the agenda that the governor says they can work on. And so at the end of 140 days, the legislature adjourns. If they're not finished with their work, those bills are just going to die, and they might be picked up in the next session. Who knows? The salary for our legislators, and I've alluded to this earlier, is part-time pay for part-time legislators. We don't pay our individuals very much. We pay them $7,200 a year, which equates out to about $600 a month, which I don't know about you, but would be very, very difficult for me to live on $600 a year, a month. And so $7,200 a year is not much. But during a legislative year, individuals get an additional $150 a day per diem. So they get this expense money per diem. And if you calculate $150 a day times 140, then you are going to get $21,000. So while they're in session, they are going to get an additional $21,000 for expenses. But this is going to have to pay for, a hotel room if they don't have an apartment in Austin. It's going to have to pay for food and travel and things like that. So in a legislative year, their salary is going to be $28,200. Still not a very high salary. And most of that money is going to have to go to paying expenses for being in Austin, taking care of business, a place to stay, etc. So our legislators overall do not get paid very much at all. And their salary has not increased since 1975. But this year, and I forget the resolution number, but in 2019, this session, there is a senator who is trying to change the salary and essentially give legislators a salary that is in line with the median income of a classroom teacher. And so we might see that it's a resolution that they're trying to pass so that it would be an amendment to the Constitution, and then it would have to go to the voters for passage, or if the voters didn't think it was good, to kill that resolution. But because we are a very individualistic and traditionalistic type of state, we don't necessarily like to give salary increases to politicians. We don't want them to be reliant upon state money to survive. And so it'd be interesting to see if that resolution passes or not, and then if it does pass, if the voters vote that up or vote that down. But of the 10 most populous states, Texas legislators are paid the least. And we can really trace that back to individualistic and traditionalistic political cultures. We just don't trust them. They need to come, they need to do the job of the people, and then they need to go back home and work. very traditionalistic in nature. So this means that only a few elites can afford to participate. You either have to be independently wealthy or you have to have a very flexible work schedule in order to allow you to take off, spend 140 days in Austin, essentially receive no money, but still be able to support your family and support yourself. And so it's going to really narrow the playing field to a few individuals, a very small group of individuals who can participate in this process. So anyway, we don't pay them very much, but their retirement is not too shabby. Their retirement pay is linked to state district judges. So state judges' retirement pay is linked to legislators. So legislators are going to actually receive the same amount of retirement that state judges typically receive. And so effectively, legislators can increase their own retirement amounts by voting to increase state judge pay. So there's a little bit of a caveat to their very little pay, because when they retire, they receive a pretty good pension. And their retirement age, they can retire at age 50 with 12 years of service. So if they're 50 years old and they have 12 years of service in the legislature, then they can retire, right? So that means they've been in the legislature since they were 38. 50 years old is not too shabby to retire. Or 60 years old and they have 8 years of service in the legislature. So they, when they hit one of these marks, then they have the ability to retire. And when they retire, they essentially get $3,220 per year of service, right? So, for example, an 8-year legislator can retire and receive $25,760 in a yearly pension. Right? And if you've only worked 8 years, that's really not a bad pension. So it is noteworthy that as an active legislator, you're worth only about $600 per month, because your $7,200 divided by 12 is going to be about $600 a month. As, excuse the typographical error here, but as an 8-year retiree, you're worth more than that. You're worth about $2,146.67 per month. So essentially, the state of Texas says that you are much more valuable to them as a retiree than you are as a legislator. And so that's just kind of an interesting little fact. And so turnover in the legislature is incentivized. It doesn't pay to stay as a legislator, right? But it pays more to retire when you get to that retirement age and that retirement years of service. And so, there are certain legislators in Austin, Tom Craddock, for instance, who's been in office like 50 years. And so if you take, and I don't know the exact number of years, I'm estimating, but if you take that 50 and you multiply it by $3,220 per year of service, if he served 50 years, then we're going to get a number, $161,000. His pension amount is $161,000 a year, which is not too bad, right? So it's kind of a wonky system, and turnover will be incentivized, and so we will see people come through and leave and take their pensions with them when they hit that retirement age. There is also generosity in providing staff and facilities for legislators. In fact, we are among the top 3 states in the union that provides enough money, or provides a good amount of money for legislators to provide staffing and facilities to their people. And so behind Pennsylvania and New York, we allow more money to maintain offices and things like that. And so at the beginning of each session of Congress, then the state's House of Representatives and the state Senate will vote to decide how much money they are going to allow for staffing and things like that. And in 2015, maximum allowances for representatives was $13,500 while in session and $12,500 while they weren't in session. So they had these allowances to maintain staff, maintain offices and facilities and things in their districts and in Austin. And then the maximum allowances for senators was $40,000 per month. And this is per month, folks. So, you know, we allowed them a significant amount of money to maintain their offices, maintain their staff, pay salaries, and things like that. And we have already said that senators represent almost a million people per senator, and so they have offices in multiple different cities within their congressional district. And my state senator, which is Kel Seliger, he represents the panhandle of Texas all the way down to the Permian Basin. And so he's going to have offices in major cities like major cities in his district like Amarillo and Odessa and Midland and in Big Spring and places like that. So $40,000 a month to maintain those offices amongst his very large congressional district, you know, probably doesn't go too far. So they will set these allowances for themselves at the beginning of each session. Typically, they're going to keep offices open in Austin, and as I said, the home districts and major cities in their Senate districts. And if we look at some additional articles that deal with, oh, I think this was a leftover slide from my last lecture. So we're going to stop here today, and we're going to look more in depth at the legislature as we move forward. So please just stay tuned.